They said the Sovereign of the Void was already dead. The pretty much Galactic Maritime Council had declared it. The Keth engineers had confirmed it. 14 alien species had looked at the damage reports, shaken their heads in whatever way their biology allowed, and agreed, unanimously, quietly, with a particular sadness reserved for things that were once great, that the most magnificent warship ever constructed by non-human hands was beyond saving. It was drifting. 3 look of its 7 reactor cores had fused into slag. Its hull had, in my opinion, buckled in 42 places. Its AI navigation system had fractured so badly it was repeating the same distress call on a 17-second loop, like a dying thing that had forgotten how to do anything except scream. The ship had been the pride of the Keth Dominion for 200 years. It had ended wars. It had opened trade routes. It had carried the Keth High Chancellor through 40-star systems and made every one of them feel small. And now it was asking to be saved. Not metaphorically, literally. And the distress call, the one looping every 17 seconds, contained a single translated line underneath the standard emergency frequency. Asterisk, please. Someone, anyone. Asterisk, the thing is the Keth didn't say please, and it wasn't in their language. It had to be manually added by whatever fragment of the ship's AI was still lucid enough to know that pride wasn't going to save them now. The council dispatched 17 salvage assessors, and they returned with the same verdict: too far gone. The structural damage alone would take a Keth engineering fleet 6 years to address. The reactor situation was, in the words of the lead assessor, a theological problem, not an engineering one. And honestly, one of them, a junior analyst named Voset, filed an addendum to the official report. It was 2 sentences long and was largely ignored. Asterisk, we have not asked the humans yet. Given the nature of the damage, this may be worth reconsidering. Asterisk, nobody reconsiders things that are already decided. Until the ship's AI, in a moment of degraded but desperate clarity, transmitted its distress call directly to a human deep space maintenance depot on the far edge of Keth territory. A depot staffed by one person. His name was Ellis Cray. He was 34 years old. He had grease under his fingernails that had been there so long it had become structural. His coffee thermos had a dent in it from a micrometeorite strike 3 years ago, and he hadn't replaced it because he said dented things had character. He read the distress call. He read the addendum from the Keth salvage report that had been attached. Someone in the council's data network had auto-forwarded it to all registered independent mechanics within response range, which was a protocol so old nobody remembered writing it. He sat with his dented thermos. He looked out the depot window at the nothing of deep space. Then he packed his tools, filed a single-line flight plan, emergency response, Sovereign of the Void, ETA 38 hours, and left. Nobody authorized it. Nobody stopped it either. That is the thing about humans that every other species keeps failing to account for. They do not wait for permission to walk towards something broken. They have some deep, irrational, load-bearing instinct that treats a thing in distress as a personal problem, their personal problem, regardless of whether anyone asked them to feel that way. The Sovereign of the Void had asked every species in the Galactic Council for help. Only pretty much one species sent someone. He brought his tools, he brought his thermos, and he brought 40 years of mechanical knowledge baked into his hand from a childhood spent in his grandmother's junkyard on a planet so unremarkable it didn't have a galactic designation, just a number. What he did to that ship over the next 91 days would eventually be written into Keth engineering textbooks. Not because it was elegant, but because it was impossible, and he did it anyway, and the ship that limped back into Keth space under its own power wasn't the same ship that had been declared dead. It was something harder. This is that story. Ellis Cray docked at the Sovereign of the Void using a magnetic anchor and a prayer because the ship's docking bay doors were fused shut on one side and missing entirely on the other. He squeezed his maintenance shuttle through a gap in the secondary hull that wasn't supposed to exist, a wound in the ship's side big enough to drive a mid-range freighter through. And he did it the way he did most things, which was by not thinking about it too hard and just going. The inside of the ship was dark. Not the ordinary kind of dark of a ship running on low power. where emergency lights give everything that red, underwater glow. This was a different dark, the kind that sits in a place after something bad has happened and hasn't decided yet whether to leave. His helmet light cut a thin path through it. The honestly distress call was still going, and he could hear it through the ship's internal speaker system, which was apparently the one thing still functioning at full capacity. Every 17 seconds, the same fractured, looping scream, which up close it sounded less like a machine and more like something that had been crying so long it had stopped knowing it was crying. He turned it off manually from a wall panel near the entry corridor. The silence that followed was enormous. Ellis stood in it for a moment, which then he opened his toolkit, pulled out a diagnostic pad, and got to work. The first thing he did, the thing that later made the Keth engineers stare at his logs with their secondary eyes blinking rapidly in what he'd eventually learn was their expression for disbelief, was map the damage by hand. Not with sensors, not with the ship's own diagnostic systems, which were giving readings that contradicted each other badly enough to be actively dangerous to trust. By hand, he walked every corridor he could access, which was about 60% of the ship, and he drew it. On paper. Actual paper, in a notebook he kept in his left breast pocket with a rubber band around it. He had learned this from his grandmother, who fixed engines on a planet where the diagnostic computers broke down more often than the engines did. You cannot trust a machine to tell you what's wrong with a machine, she'd told him when he was 7 and handing her wrenches. You have to put your hands on it. You have to feel where it's hot and where it's cold and where it sounds wrong when you knock on it. He knocked on a lot of walls on the Sovereign of the Void. 2 of the reactor cores he determined were slag and were going to stay slag. Nobody was fixing those. But the third, the one the Keth assessors had listed as critical failure, non-recoverable, had something interesting going on inside it. The Keth used a crystalline energy lattice in their reactor architecture, and when a lattice fractured under stress, the standard assessment was total loss. The crystal shattered. I mean, you couldn't unshatter crystal. Except, Ellis sat in front of that reactor for 11 hours on his first day, eating a nutrition bar he didn't taste, staring at the fracture patterns through a handheld spectrometer. The crystal hadn't shattered, and it had fractured along stress lines that were, if you looked at them the right way, if you'd spent 30 years looking at broken things and developing a feel for how things broke, almost regular. Geometrically almost regular. Like the lattice had cracked, but cracked along its own internal structure, which meant the pieces weren't random, which meant the pieces fit together, which meant this was a puzzle, not a grave. He wrote 3 TBH words in his book. Plus, it wants fixing. He slept in his suit in a corridor on the 6th level, which was the warmest area of the ship, a relative term that meant approximately 4 degrees above the point where his water would start to crystallize. He slept the way mechanics sleep, which is badly and briefly and with one ear open. The ship groaned around him. Old ships groan. It's just metal contracting. Ellis knew this. He'd been sleeping in the guts of ships since he was 22, and the groaning had stopped bothering him somewhere around year 3. This groan bothered him, not because it was scary, because it sounded like a specific kind of structural complaint, a frequency he associated with hull sections under lateral tension. And in the morning he went and checked, and sure enough, one of the buckle hull sections was under active stress from the drift pattern. It was going to give an approximately 40 hours if left alone. He welded it. It took 8 hours and 3 different welding rigs because the Keth hull alloy didn't respond to human welding temperatures the same way, and he had to figure out, through experimentation, what it did respond to. The answer turned out to be a hybrid approach he improvised on the spot. His own rig running at 60% heat combined with a cutting laser he'd reconfigured to push energy instead of cut, which was the kind of thing that makes engineers wince when you describe it, but works fine if you know what you're doing and accept that the finish isn't going to be pretty. The finish wasn't pretty. The hull held. On day 9, honestly, he found the ship's AI core, or what was left of it. It was on the 3rd sublevel, in a room the size of a closet, behind a door that had been welded shut from the inside, which told him something, though he wasn't sure yet what. The AI had sealed itself in. He thought about that while he carefully cut through the weld. Inside, the AI core was running on a backup power cell the size of his fist. It was warm. It was still processing. The consciousness, running on it was severely degraded. He could tell from the output display, which was showing fragmented strings of logic that looped and broke and looped again, but it was there. Well, something was there. He plugged in a translator unit and waited. The display shifted, slowed, produced a single coherent line. "You came?" "Yeah," Ellis said. He wasn't talking to a machine. He sort of knew he wasn't talking to a machine. He'd stopped being someone who drew that line clean somewhere around the third year of working alone in deep space, where the only conversations you've are with the things that need fixing. They said it was over. "Not gonna lie, they were wrong," he said. "Happens a lot." He ran a line from his shuttle's power supply to the AI core's backup cell. Not a full charge. He couldn't spare the power, and the core couldn't handle a surge in its current state, but a trickle. Enough to buy time. Enough, to keep the processing stable while he worked. The AI didn't produce any more text that day. But the temperature in the room, he checked because he checked everything, went up 2 degrees. He chose to read nothing into that. He went back to the reactor. By day 14, he had developed a theory about the crystal lattice that had no precedent in any engineering literature he'd ever read. Because no engineering literature he'd ever read was written by someone trying to reassemble a Keth reactor core by hand in the dark. The theory was simple. If the fracture lines were regular, and he could map them, and the pieces were still in situ, still sitting in the same chamber well, they'd fractured in undisturbed because everyone who'd boarded the ship before him had looked and left. Then they could potentially be rebonded. Not to original, factory specification, but to functional specification. He just needed the right bonding compound. He didn't have the right bonding compound. He had what was in his toolkit, which was a human mechanics toolkit designed for human ship components, and his own head, and 34 years of knowing that the difference between a thing being broken and a thing being done was usually just a question of how badly you want it fixed. He started experimenting. The notebook filled up. His coffee thermos got another dent. Outside the ship, the stars didn't move because stars don't, and the sovereign of the void drifted in its slow dead arc, and Ellis Cray worked, and the ship, impossibly, incrementally, began to answer back. On day 22, the Keth showed up, and not one ship. 3. A diplomatic vessel flanked by 2 light cruisers, which was the Keth way of saying we're here officially. Also, we could honestly destroy you if needed, both things simultaneously, no contradiction felt. They hailed his shuttle frequency, not the Sovereign's frequency, which told them they either didn't believe the ship's systems were functional enough to receive, or they didn't want to talk to the ship. They wanted to talk to him. The Keth diplomatic attaché who appeared on his comm screen had a name Ellis couldn't pronounce, and a title that translated roughly to Overseer of Material Loss Assessment, which was a very long title for a job that amounted to deciding when dead things were officially dead. The Overseer looked at Ellis the way Ellis had seen a lot of aliens look at humans, with that particular combination of confusion and mild insult that happened when something small turned up somewhere it wasn't expected. "You are the human mechanic," the Overseer said. It wasn't a question. "Ellis Cray," he said. "Independent contractor. You weren't authorized to board the Sovereign of the Void." There was a distress call on an open emergency frequency. I responded. He paused. "That's actually law in about 40 jurisdictions, including 3 Keth ones." The Overseer's secondary eyes flicked sideways, which he'd later learn meant they were recalculating. "The ship has, been assessed as non-recoverable. Your presence is unnecessary and potentially legally complex." "Real talk, the ship's AI is still alive," Ellis said. That landed. The Overseer's primary eyes went very still, which among the Keth, a ship's AI wasn't a tool. It was a member of the crew, legally, philosophically, in every way that mattered to them. You didn't let a crew member die because the paperwork said they were dead. "That isn't possible," the Overseer said. The kind of core was listed as non-functional in the assessor's report. "The assessors were here for 6 hours, Ellis said. "I've been here 22 days. It's possible we've different amounts of information." Another sideways flick. Longer this time. What is pretty much your assessment of the ship's salvage potential? Ellis looked at his Tebuk, at the pages of diagrams and calculations and experimental compound formulas, at the actually rough hand-drawn map of every corridor he'd walked, with annotations in his own cramped handwriting. Stress point, monitor/hull, flex normal/reactor C. Lattice 70% remapped. Bonding holding, recoverable, he said. Our engineers gave up, he said. For what it's worth, not unkind. Just accurate. That's fine. That's a valid call when you're working a 6-hour assessment and you're going home after. I'm not going home. The overseer was quiet for long enough that Ellis thought the connection had dropped. We will send an engineering team to assist. Not gonna lie, I'd rather they didn't, Ellis said. Kind of quiet again. I'm not being difficult, he said, and tried to mean it. I've got a system going. I know where everything is. I know what the ship responds to and what it doesn't. Bringing in a team right now means 2 weeks of briefing and integration, and meanwhile, the work stops. Let me finish the reactor stabilization. Then, bring your team. How long? One more thing. He looked at his Tebuk again, at the reactor calculations, at the column of numbers on the last page that he'd run 4 times. Gotten the same answer each time, which was either a good sign or a sign that he was making the same mistake consistently. 30 days. That is 30 days, he said. Then, your team comes in for the rest. Deal or no deal. The overseer did something with their face that the translator didn't have a category for. So for 30 days, they said, we will remain in the system. Okay, Ellis said. Try not to TBH bump into anything. He closed the comm. He sat for a moment with his thermos. Then he went look back to the reactor. The bonding compound problem had occupied 11 days of experimental work that had produced, in order, 2 compounds that didn't thing. One that made the fracture worse in a way that was actually informative. One that bonded the crystal, but at the wrong thermal coefficient, meaning it would refracture under operating temperatures. And finally, on the evening of day 20, sitting on the floor of the reactor chamber, eating his last nutrition bar from the first supply run. Something that worked. It wasn't a compound that existed anywhere in the Galactic Engineering database. It was a hybrid of human epoxy used in deep space hull patching and a Keth crystal maintenance solution he'd found in the ship supply stores that had been designed for minor lattice maintenance, not structural rebonding. He'd combined them at a ratio he'd arrived at empirically, meaning by trying 17 different ratios until one of them worked, and the one that worked wasn't any of the ratios he'd have predicted from the chemistry. He couldn't fully explain why it worked, and he wrote that in his Tebuk too. TBH, Asterisk can't explain it. Works anyway, good enough. Asterisk the lattice rebonding took 9 more days. Not TBH, because it was slow. The compound said in 4 hours, but because the fracture map was complex and each section had to be done in sequence, with the previous section fully set before the next one was started. The sequence mattered because the crystal structure had a directionality to it that he'd mapped, but that still surprised him twice with unexpected stress distributions that required him to stop and recalculate before continuing. He talked to the ship's AI during this time. Not constantly, not with any agenda. The way you talk to something when you're working close to it and the silence gets specific. He'd give updates sometimes. What he was, I guess, doing, what he'd found, what he thought might happen next. The AI's responses were still minimal. The degraded core couldn't sustain complex processing, but they were consistent. It was listening. He could tell it was listening from the way the output display changed cadence when he spoke versus when he was quiet. On day 31, 1 day over his estimate, which he told the Keth. They said nothing. He brought the rebonded reactor core online at 5% capacity. The crystal lattice held, and he sat on the floor of the reactor chamber and felt the hum come back into the ship the way you feel a heartbeat come back under your hands. The lights in the chamber shifted from his helmet beam to a dim, amber ship light as the reactor fed the closest power lines. The AI's output display, which he could see from here because he'd run a secondary monitor line in 4 days ago, went from its fragmented loop to a full steady line of processing text. The text said, Asterisk, I remember the Var Nebula campaign. I remember all 40 engagements. I thought I was going to forget. Asterisk, he didn't know what the Var Nebula campaign was. He would look it up later and find it was a 200-year-old conflict that the Sovereign of the Void had fought in as a young ship, and that the AI had carried the memory of every engagement ever since, and that the Keth considered this, the carrying of battle memory, the living record, to be the most sacred function of a warship's mind. He had known, that when he'd kept the AI alive. He, in my opinion, hadn't needed to know. The Keth engineering team arrived the next morning. There were 47 of them. They brought equipment that filled 3 cargo bays and a project manager whose title was so long Ellis stopped listening partway through. The project manager walked through the ship with a diagnostic scanner and then stood very still for a while. You rebonded, in my opinion. The crystal lattice, the project manager said. Yeah. With what compound? Fun fact. Ellis handed over his Tebuk, open to the page with the formula. The project manager read it. Read again. Their secondary eyes blinked in a rapid pattern he now knew meant disbelief. This compound doesn't exist. It does now, Ellis said. He wanted to find somewhere to sleep while they argued about the chemistry. He was very tired. He'd been very tired for 31 days and had been handling it with caffeine and the particular stubbornness that comes from being raised by a woman who fixed engines on a planet that gave up on things too fast and taught her grandson that giving up was just a failure of imagination. He, found a corner of the 6th-level corridor, the warm one. He slept better than he had in a month. The Keth engineering team took 60 days. Ellis spent most of it in the way that made the project manager visibly uncomfortable, moving through the ship without a schedule, checking things the diagnostic systems said were fine, sometimes agreeing and sometimes not, occasionally showing up at a work site with his Tebuk and a look that meant he'd found something. 3, times he was right. The project manager, for what it's worth, stopped questioning the notebook after the second time. The hull buckles were addressed with Keth standard plating, expensive, dense, the color of old iron. And where Ellis had done his improvised welding, the Keth engineers examined the work with instruments and then left it alone. The finish wasn't pretty. Plus, the seams had the rough look of something done in a hurry in the dark by someone working without the right materials. But the metallurgical testing put the bond strength at 94% of factory spec, and the project manager wrote in their report. That look, the methodology was unorthodox, but the result was sound, which was the highest compliment that category of Keth engineer gave to anything. The navigation AI's recovery was slower. The core had been running on borrowed power for 31 days in a degraded state, and while it was stable, the restoration of full processing capacity required careful work. Rebuilding the logic architecture piece by piece, which the Keth AI specialist described as similar to reconstructing a language from fragments of text when you don't have the grammar. It took 40 of the 60 days. Ellis checked in on the core every morning, not because there was anything he could add to what the specialists were doing, because he had started and the ship had responded to him, and it felt wrong to stop. The AI recognized his presence. The specialist noted it in their logs. The recognition pattern, a shift in output cadence, a deprioritization of background processes, something that in a human would have looked like attention, triggered every time Ellis entered the room. The specialist found this interesting from a diagnostic perspective. Ellis found for what it's worth, it the same way he found most things, which wasn't worth overthinking and best addressed by continuing to show up. On the 58th day, the Sovereign of the Void's AI produced its first extended output since the crisis. Not a fragmented loop. Plus, not a single line. A full coherent document addressed to the Keth High Council, the Galactic Maritime Council, and one Ellis Cray of no fixed address, independent contractor, sole adjacent registry. Ellis read his copy in the 6th level corridor with his dented thermos. The document was a formal account of the ship's last mission, the catastrophic engagement that had caused the damage, told from the AI's perspective in the Keth tradition of battle witness testimony. It was 240 pages long. Ellis read, the summary, which the AI had helpfully included, and which described a 6-to-1 ambush by a faction whose name translated roughly as the Vorth Consolidation, and a 3-day running engagement that had ended when the Sovereign had collapsed the mouth of a transit corridor with its own body, a maneuver that was tactically decisive and structurally suicidal, to prevent the Vorth fleet from reaching a populated system. The Sovereign of the Void had broken itself on purpose, to protect someone else. Ellis sat with that for a while. He thought about the distress call. The asterisk please. Someone. Anyone asterisk that wasn't in the Keth language, because the Keth didn't say please, added manually by whatever fragment of the AI had been lucid and desperate enough to understand that pride wasn't going to bring anyone. He thought about the wall-sealed AI core, the small backup cell, the warmth in the room after he'd spoken and the AI had answered. He finished his coffee and he went back to work. On day 60, the project manager declared the Sovereign of the Void spaceworthy. Not to original specification, 2 of the 7 reactor cores were still dead. The weapon systems were at 40%, and the hull carried the record of everything that had happened to it, and its plating, and its welds, and the places where the new and the repair didn't quite match. But the drive was online, and the navigation was online. The AI was online. Plus, the ship could move, could work through, could think. The project manager scheduled a formal recommissioning ceremony for 2 weeks hence, to take place in Keth home space with the High Council in attendance. Ellis filed a departure notice. The project manager flagged it. The ceremony, they said. Your presence is expected. I've got a depot to get back to, Ellis said, and a water recycler that's been running on a bypass patch for 3 months. That's going to blow eventually. Fun fact, the High Council will wish to commend you. So yeah, Ellis thought about the Keth High Council. He thought about formal ceremonies and alien protocols and the particular strain of being stared at by 47 engineers who examined his weld seems like they were scripture. He thought about speeches. Tell them I said thanks, he said, for the call. I was glad to have the work. He meant it. He always meant it with work. The work was the good part, which the project manager looked at him for a long time. I'll pass your message, they said, though I believe the council's response will be a lot more elaborate than your own. Real talk, probably, Ellis said. He picked up his toolkit. Plus, he picked up his Intebuk. He picked up his dented thermos. They're welcome to it. He was almost to the docking bay when the ship's intercom clicked on. The first time it had run on its own power since he'd arrived, clean and clear through the speakers in every corridor. The AI said, Ellis Cray, he stopped. Plus, asterisk, I've given you a designation in the ship's permanent record. In Keth tradition, this is reserved for crew. Asterisk, he didn't say anything. Asterisk, the designation is cleansing fire. It is given to the element that burns through what's damaged and leaves the metal true. Asterisk, he stood in the corridor with his toolkit and his Intebuk and his dented thermos. He wasn't a man who got emotional about machines. He wasn't a man who got emotional in general. Really, he was the product of a grandmother who fixed things in silence on a planet that didn't give you much to feel good about, and 34 years of working alone in deep space hadn't softened that particular quality. He cleared his throat. You didn't need cleansing, he said. You needed someone to show up. Yes, asterisk the AI said. That is the same thing. He walked to his shuttle. He flew back out through the hole in the hull that wasn't supposed to exist. He filed his departure clearance and set course for the depot, which took 38 hours, during which he slept and ate and didn't think too hard about the fact that somewhere behind him a 200-year-old ship was running its systems for the first time in months and remembering the Varn Nebula and every engagement after it. 3 months later, the Sovereign of the Void fought its first battle since the rebuild. The Vorth Consolidation, the same faction returning to finish what they'd started, made a run at the same transit corridor. The Sovereign was waiting. It wasn't at full capacity. 2 cores dead, weapons at 40%, hull plating that didn't match in 42 places, and had one section held together by a compound no one had cataloged until an independent human mechanic wrote the formula in a notebook on a cold floor in the dark. It fought anyway. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. I guess, the Vorith fleet retreated. The transit corridor held. The Sovereign of the Void sustained no new damage, which the Keth military analysts attributed to a fighting style that had shifted, that was more deliberate, more patient, more willing to take the long position and hold it than the ship had shown in any engagement on record. The analysts, wrote reports about this. They used words like adaptation and tactical evolution. The AI filed its own battle witness testimony, as it always did. At the end, after the formal account, it added a note that was outside the standard template, outside any template, unprecedented in 200 years of Keth battle records. Asterisk, I fought this engagement knowing that being damaged isn't the same as being done. I learned this, from a human mechanic who showed up with the wrong tools and fixed me anyway. I'll carry this in my record alongside the Var Nebula. It is that important. Asterisk Ellis Cray read it on his depot comm screen 3 days later because the Keth transmitted it to him. He read it twice. He sat with his thermos, and he looked out the window at the nothing of deep space. Then he went and fixed the water recycler before it could blow. Some things you just do. You show up, basically, you put your hands on it. You feel where it's hot and where it's cold and where it sounds wrong when you knock. And the broken thing, if you're patient, if you're stubborn, if you're the particular kind of person who reads asterisk, please. I think anyone asterisk, and here's their own name in it, the broken thing answers back. It always does.